The forgotten ones. The hospital loomed in front of me, a crumbling relic from a time when doctors carried more tools than just scalpels. It was Halloween night, and the charity event organizers thought it would be fun to bring a bit of life back to this forgotten building, or rather to use it for cheap thrills. They dressed it up with fake cobwebs and rubber skeletons, but even that kitschy decor couldn't mask the coldness that seeped from the stone walls. I adjusted my costume, a nurse's uniform they'd provided me. It felt wrong, almost like wearing a shroud. But the job was simple. Guide visitors through the hospital's twisted halls, tell a few ghost stories, and let them get their scare before leading them safely back out. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't intrigued by the building itself. Its history was tragic, filled with stories of patients who were tucked away from society and left to rot. The visitors had just left for the night, but I was still wandering the halls, more out of curiosity than duty. My flashlight cast jagged shadows across peeling wallpaper and exposed wires. The silence pressed in on me, heavy and dense. It wasn't until I reached the third floor that I realized I was truly alone. A thought flickered across my mind like a spark in the dark. I had been the only volunteer for this part of the hospital tonight. I moved down the hallway, glancing into rooms as I passed. Empty beds, shattered glass, medical instruments scattered like toys. But in each room, I felt watched. The hairs on the back of my neck rose, but I kept going, telling myself it was just the chill in the air. I was halfway down the hall when I heard it, the distinct sound of footsteps, but they weren't behind me. They were ahead, coming from a room on the left. I stopped, listening, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. The footsteps stopped too. I swallowed, stepped forward, and shone my flashlight into the room. The room was empty. I sighed, but my relief was short-lived. I turned back, ready to head down to the exit, when a cold hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. My flashlight flickered and then died, plunging me into darkness. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. There was a faint sound, a whisper, barely audible but unmistakably there. It came from all around me, like voices layered over one another. I struggled to make out the words, but they were twisted, a language almost forgotten. The hallway stretched before me, but now something was different. From the corners of my vision, shadows twisted and writhed, shapes moving with an unnatural gait. I pressed forward, quickening my pace. The walls seemed to close in, the hallway lengthening with each step. My breathing was shallow, each intake of air thick with the scent of decay. And then I saw them. Figures, barely visible but undoubtedly there, standing in the doorways. Faces twisted in anguish, eyes hollow and accusing. They reached out, hands gnarled and desperate, clawing at the air between us. I stumbled back, my foot catching on something soft. I glanced down and saw a body, decayed, twisted, and grinning up at me with empty eye sockets. I bolted, running back the way I came. The shadows pursued me, their whispers now a cacophony of rage and despair. I reached the exit door, flung it open, and collapsed outside, gasping for air. As I turned back to look at the building, I saw them. Dozens of ghostly figures pressed against the windows, watching, waiting. And in that moment, I knew that they weren't done with me. They were waiting for me to return, to claim me as one of their own. As I caught my breath, a thought struck me with a chill deeper than the October wind. The hospital wasn't abandoned. It had never been empty. It was still full, but with souls that had been forgotten until now. And they were determined to make sure no one would ever forget them again. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the faces returned, those hollow eyes staring back at me, filled with a bitterness that clawed at my insides. I couldn't shake the feeling of their hands reaching for me, pulling me back into the hospital. But the cold light of dawn eventually seeped through my bedroom window, and with it, I managed to convince myself that it was all just the product of an overactive imagination, fueled by the eerie atmosphere of an old hospital. By evening, though, the dread had crept back in. The event organizers had called, needing help with cleanup. I knew I should say no, but something compelled me to return, like a moth to a flame, or a nightmare revisited. It was as if the hospital had latched onto a part of me, tugging me back. As I approached the building, I noticed it looked different in the daylight. Less threatening, but more sad, as if it mourned the things that had happened within its walls. I stepped through the main doors, greeted by a musty silence that felt like a held breath. A few other volunteers moved through the lobby, collecting discarded decorations and props. I offered to handle the third floor, though I had no idea why. The halls felt tighter this time, almost as if they remembered me. Every creak and groan of the old structure seemed louder, amplified by the silence around me. I found myself walking the same route as before, back toward that room where I'd heard the footsteps. But now, daylight streamed in through cracked windows, casting thin beams of light that did little to dispel the shadows lurking in the corners. When I reached the room, I hesitated before stepping inside. The air was colder here, somehow denser. I scanned the room, half expecting to see those ghostly figures again, but it was empty. Or so I thought. A small noise caught my attention. It was coming from behind a closet door in the corner. I edged closer, my pulse quickening. I didn't want to open it, but my hand moved as if on its own. I gripped the handle and pulled, and for a moment, all I could see was darkness. Then a faint sickly odor hit me, a mixture of mildew and rot. The closet was filled with old hospital records, stacks of papers, and medical charts yellowed with age. I started rifling through them, trying to piece together the story of this place. The files were patient records, some of them dating back decades. They detailed various ailments, treatments, and in more cases than I expected, death. But as I scanned the names, one in particular stood out. The file was thin, containing only a few pages, but the entries were haunting. It detailed the last days of a patient, admitted for an unknown illness. The words severe mental decline were scrawled in the margins, along with a note that read, deceased, body not claimed. It was as if they'd been erased from existence, forgotten, left to rot in the walls of this place. My hands trembled as I turned to the last page, and that's when I saw it. My own name written in faded ink. I blinked, convinced my mind was playing tricks on me. But no matter how many times I looked, it was there, etched into the brittle paper like a whisper from the past. A sudden chill washed over me, and I could feel the temperature drop even further. I wasn't alone. I turned around, and there in the doorway stood a figure. It was barely visible, more shadow than form, but I could see its eyes, cold, vacant, and fixed on me. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the closet door and sprawling onto the floor. The figure moved closer, and as it did, I saw more of them, emerging from the walls, slipping out of doorways, their faces twisted in rage and sorrow. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. But no matter how far I ran, they seemed to be right behind me, their shadows stretching along the walls, reaching out as if to pull me into their world. I could feel their whispers in my ears, words I couldn't understand but that filled me with a dread I couldn't escape. When I finally reached the stairs, I bolted down them, 2 at a time, my breath coming in gasps. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the cold evening air, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But as I looked back at the hospital, I saw them, their faces pressed against the windows, watching me with hollow eyes. They weren't just spirits. They were trapped, forgotten, and furious. As I walked away, I realized that I hadn't escaped them. They were with me now, their anger and sorrow seeping into my bones. And somehow I knew I'd be back. The hospital had its grip on me, and it wasn't going to let go so easily. I told myself I wouldn't return. I told myself I could forget. But the hospital clung to my mind like a parasite, and no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the memories, or the feeling that I was still being watched. The faces in the windows haunted my dreams, the hollow eyes following me everywhere I went. Days passed, but the sense of dread only grew. I could swear I saw those figures on the streets, out of the corner of my eye, always watching. Sometimes I'd hear faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing, or feel a chill that seemed to seep right into my bones. It felt like the spirits had followed me, and I was their unwilling prisoner. Eventually, the pull of the hospital became too much to ignore. I knew I had to go back. There were too many unanswered questions, too many shadows lurking in my mind. I had to know why they'd marked me, why my name was in that file. And I had to know if there was a way to break free from whatever grip they had on me. The building was even more oppressive the third time around. The air was thicker, the silence heavier, like the walls were closing in. I walked through the main doors, past the empty lobby, and up the stairs to the 3rd floor. I carried a flashlight, though I wasn't sure it would help. The darkness felt alive, swallowing the light before it could even reach the walls. I retraced my steps to the room with the closet, but this time I wasn't alone. The moment I stepped inside, I saw her, a figure standing in the corner, facing away from me. Her shoulders were hunched, and her long hair hung limp around her face. She looked fragile, almost like she'd break if I touched her, but there was something wrong about her stillness. It was unnatural, as if she were waiting. I took a step forward, and the floor creaked beneath my weight. Her head snapped up, and I froze. Slowly, she turned to face me, and my heart stopped. Her face was a twisted mask of sorrow and rage, her eyes empty and hollow, but I recognized her. She looked exactly like me. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hands. The figure took a step toward me, her movements slow and deliberate. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, only a silent scream that seemed to echo inside my head, rattling my thoughts. I turned and bolted from the room, but she followed, her footsteps echoing mine, growing louder and louder until they were a thunderous roar that filled the hallway. I ran blindly, twisting through the corridors, trying to escape the shadow that chased me. The walls seemed to warp and stretch, pulling me deeper into a labyrinth of decay and rot. I could hear other footsteps now, countless pairs of feet shuffling through the darkness, closing in from all sides. The whispers returned, louder this time, forming words that clawed at my mind, words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. I burst into another room, slamming the door behind me. The air was thick with the stench of mildew, and the floor was slick under my feet. I fumbled with the flashlight, and as the beam flickered to life, I saw them. Dozens of figures standing in the shadows, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes locked on me. They weren't human anymore, if they ever had been. Their flesh was gray and mottled, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. They moved as one, stepping closer, their arms reaching out. I backed against the wall, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. I raised the flashlight, shining it on their faces, and for a moment they recoiled. I could see the pain etched into their features, the desperation that clung to them like a second skin. They weren't just angry, they were tormented, lost in a darkness that had consumed them, and now they wanted me to join them. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the room, cutting through the whispers like a knife. "You can't leave," it said, low and guttural, filled with a malice that chilled me to the core. I spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows moved, coalescing into a shape that was almost human, but not quite. Its eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and its mouth stretched into a twisted grin. "They forgot us," it hissed, the words sliding through the air like poison. "But you will remember. You will stay." I felt something cold wrap around my wrist, and I looked down to see fingers. Thin, bony fingers with skin stretched taut over the bone, digging into my flesh. I tried to pull away, but their grip tightened, pulling me down, dragging me into the darkness. I screamed, thrashing against the hands that held me, but it was no use. The shadows closed in, suffocating, drowning me in their despair. And then just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I was alone, lying on the cold, damp floor, gasping for breath. The room was empty, the figures gone, but their presence lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on me. I staggered to my feet, my entire body trembling. I had to get out. I had to escape before they changed their minds and dragged me back. As I made my way to the exit, I could feel their eyes on me, watching from the shadows, waiting. I knew I hadn't escaped them. They'd let me go, but only for now. And as I stumbled out into the night, I knew one thing for certain. They weren't finished with me yet. The Forgotten Ones. Part 4, I didn't want to go back, but I knew I had to. There was no escaping the pull of that hospital. The spirits weren't going to stop until they had me, until I joined them in the darkness. But I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let their anger consume me. Something inside told me there was a way out, a way to set things right, to break the hold they had on me. And deep down, I knew this time, it would be different. I returned to the hospital one last time. The building loomed in the moonlight, casting long, dark shadows across the overgrown grass. It was eerily quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. I clutched the old patient file in my hand, the one with my name scrawled in faded ink. It was the key. It had to be. As I stepped inside, the familiar cold washed over me, but this time, I didn't run. I walked with purpose, heading straight to the 3rd floor, the flashlight in my hand steady as I made my way through the twisting corridors. The silence was oppressive, but I pushed forward, determined. I knew the spirits were watching, waiting, but something had changed. I wasn't afraid anymore. I reached the same room as before, the one where I had found the closet filled with old records. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the air inside was as cold as a tomb. The room was empty, but I could feel them, waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I stepped forward and laid the file down on the bed, taking a deep breath before speaking into the darkness. "I know you're here," I said, my voice echoing off the peeling walls. "I know what happened to you, and I know you're angry, but you don't have to be forgotten anymore." There was no response at first, just the suffocating silence that pressed in around me. But then, slowly, I heard it. The whispers. They were faint at first, just a murmur, but they grew louder, filling the room with their sorrow and rage. The shadows around me began to shift, coalescing into the shapes of the spirits I had seen before. They stood there watching, waiting for me to make my move. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry for what happened to you. I'm sorry that no one remembered, that no one came to claim you. But I'm here now. I remember." The whispers faltered, and for the first time, I saw something change in their eyes. The anger was still there, but beneath it I saw something else. Pain. Desperation. A deep, aching sorrow that had been left to fester for decades. "I won't forget you," I continued, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'll make sure people know. I'll tell your stories. You won't be forgotten anymore." The air around me grew colder, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It was almost gentle, like a soft breeze brushing against my skin. The spirits stood still, their faces twisted with emotion, and then one by one they began to fade. The anger in their eyes ebbed away, replaced with something like peace. As they disappeared, the room felt lighter, as if the weight of all their suffering was finally lifting. For a moment I stood in the silence, waiting, half expecting something terrible to happen. But nothing did. The shadows were gone, the whispers had faded, and the hospital felt quiet, peaceful even. I made my way back down the stairs, stepping out into the cool night air. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the abandoned building. I took a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in days. The spirits were gone. They had found peace, and so had I. As I walked away from the hospital for the last time, I felt a sense of closure. The nightmares, the whispers, they were all behind me now. I had set them free, and in doing so, I had freed myself. I knew they were at rest now, no longer trapped in their torment. I stopped at the edge of the hospital grounds and turned back for one final look. The windows, which had once been filled with hollow, accusing eyes, were now empty. The hospital stood silent, a forgotten relic of the past. But this time I knew it wouldn't haunt me anymore. I smiled softly to myself as I walked away, the weight finally lifting from my shoulders. The hospital was behind me, and so were the spirits. I had given them what they needed, remembrance, acknowledgement, and in return, they had let me go. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was free.